Hello again, members. Welcome back for another THF conversation. I'm Catherine McMacken, Membership Manager here at the Henry Ford, and I'm really thrilled about sharing today's program with you. Today is the beginning of one of our seasonal Member Appreciation Days weekends, and as I hope you've heard, starting today, we have reopened Eagle Tavern in Greenfield Village exclusively for members. This is your special weekend to be the first back into the tavern before it opens to the public next week. And as we're focused on food this weekend, I hope you've all been looking forward to today's THF conversation, Creating the Eagle Tavern Food Experience. Our own senior curator and curator of public life, Donna Braden, was instrumental in developing the original 1850s dining experience at Eagle Tavern when it was first presented to guests. She's been researching and sharing stories here at the Henry Ford for nearly 40 years, and today she'll share stories from some of her early days, including the ideas and steps that brought our 19th century tavern experience to life. So as we get started, I hope you'll take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat feature with your first name and where you're joining us from. We can, of course, use this feature to see each other and our member community virtually. And then while you enjoy the program, please do submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. And as always, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We are so grateful that you continue to join us in our commitment to our mission as we activate new programs and bring back those favorite experiences we've all been missing. So now I'll hand it over to Donna to take us back to the early days at Eagle Tavern in Greenfield Village.
Hello, everyone. Welcome on this beautiful day. This has been a really fun topic for me to delve into, both delving into my own memory as well as my files to find some really interesting things. And I hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. I'm going to start back in 1982, April 1982. This seems like a long time ago, but I can remember it like it was just yesterday. This was the month that marked the opening of Eagle Tavern, which was our first historic dining experience in Greenfield Village. It was the result of months of research, recipe selection, recipe testing, and interpretive planning. And it was also an unusual and unique collaboration between curators, food service staff, and interpretive planners. All of those things sound easy now in retrospect because we're used to doing these kind of things and we take this for granted. It wasn't easy back then, but at the time, I was one of those young museum professionals and we were full of energy and we had a mission. And our mission was to bring more accuracy and authenticity to the village. And also, as part of that, to bring a food and dining experience to our visitors that would be truly memorable. How did this come about and what did it involve? That's what I'll be talking about today. In my mind, it started when the museum took a chance on a young leader named Harold Scramstead, who took over as our president in 1981. It's common in times of crisis for museums to assess where they stand, both in the profession and in the public eye, as we're all doing today because of COVID. And this was the case back in the early 1980s. Faced with a severe financial crisis, Scramstead quickly built a case around what he called our world-class status and our unique historical resources. This led to our very first mission statement, which was about the process of change from a rural agricultural society to an urban industrial nation. And from that, Scramstead created several task forces and committees to explore ways to carry out our mission. One of these was a committee that was mysteriously called the Food Committee. The food committee, it turned out, and as I said, it was made up of curators, food service staff, and interpretive planners, among other staff around the institution that came and went as we had meetings, charged with to bring our offerings in line with the museum's overall interpretive framework. This was the first time this had ever been thought about. So soon, new food experiences began to appear. Through our collaborative efforts, vendors hawked fruit and penny candy from rolling carts like those that were seen 100 years ago on urban street corners, as you can see on the image on the left. The covered bridge lunch stand, which had been just renamed from what was called the Pond and Coop, some of you may remember that, and is currently called Mrs. Fisher's. In that venue, we began selling what we called turn of the century picnic lunches. And you can see my typed version way back then of the draft possible menus, including cold sandwiches and just cold chicken. They both had sides, they both had vegetables and fruit, and came with drinks. And if any of you remember that, we served them in a real picnic basket with a red and white checked cloth, like a big napkin with it. It was pretty cool and pretty different. And also with the help of diner expert Richard Gutman, who told us we had the last remaining lunch wagon in existence, we overhauled the Owl night lunch wagon to look more like a late 19th century night lunch wagon, which is when it dated from, and it featured a more historic menu. But Eagle Tavern became our crown jewel as we proposed turning this historic structure back into a sit-down, full-service restaurant with period food and drink. And at this point, you may be asking, well, wasn't it always that way? And the answer to that is no, it wasn't. I will explain a little bit about what it was before that. So let's go back into history a bit on that. In 1927, looking for a stagecoach tavern for his village green, Henry Ford found this old, pretty grand 1830s era historic inn from Clinton, Michigan. Clinton is about 50 miles southwest of Detroit. It was located on the road that went from Detroit, the stagecoach road that went from Detroit to Chicago. It was called the Chicago Road. And during the 1830s, it was operated by several people and had many names. During the 1830s, it was operated by a man named James Parks, and it was called Parks Tavern. By the late 1840s, it was run by a man named Calvin Wood, a man we've come to know well, and was called Eagle Tavern. The word Eagle represented, many places were called Eagle Hotel and Eagle Tavern. It represented a kind of patriotic fervor of the time. And then during the Civil War, it came under new ownership and was renamed the Union Hotel, again, reflecting the spirit of the time. Finally, after that, it was bought by a man named Walter Smith and was called Smith's Hotel until the 1890s, when it closed and slowly fell into disrepair. Smith's daughter, Ella, shown here in this photograph in the center, continued to live in the building and owned the building until she sold it to Henry Ford in 1927. But by the early 20th century, it had so many different names, it kind of had no name at that point. And postcards and images of it would refer to it as things like the old stage house, the old stagecoach house, the old tavern at Clinton. So when Henry Ford brought the building to Greenfield Village, he must have thought, okay, well, it was from Clinton, I'm going to call it from now on Clinton Inn. And that is the name that it had up until the early 1980s when we reinstated one of its original names, Eagle Tavern. You can see it here in Greenfield Village. And as you notice, if you look at these photos, you don't see a back addition. That's because it didn't have an addition originally. It was just the front building. So when Henry Ford had it brought to Greenfield Village, he built an addition on the back. The reason he put that addition on was because he intended to have this building serve as the cafeteria for students that attended his Edison Institute schools. And that's why we have that great, wonderful space in the back today and are able to put so many diners and tables back there. So you can see the picture when on the left, the image on the left, when Clinton Inn first opened in 1929. In the center, in the beginning, Henry Ford didn't intend the village to be open to the public. He intended it as a school. But in 1933, there was so much demand, he finally allowed public visitors to come in, but had them go, at least in the historic homes area, by carriage tour. So they boarded a carriage, and Clinton Inn is the place where the carriage tour started. And then on the right, this really cool, almost Technicolor calendar with featuring Clinton Inn on it. From the 1950s, as the school waned and declined after Henry Ford's passing in 1947, it transitioned into a public cafeteria. You can see the picture on the right from 1958. And this is what it was when I first started working at the museum. It was a public cafeteria. So note the menu on the left from 1952. There's little historic about it, at least not intentionally historic, just named after buildings. And I know it's pretty small here. I'll give you a few examples. They had the Susquehanna salad plate, the Martha Mary salad bowl, the Ann Arbor cherry pie, things like that, that were just dishes, cold dishes, the kind of things people liked eating for lunch in the 1950s with the names of buildings on the front of them. I do like the little friendly introduction. It says, a luncheon suggestion for a pleasant midday break in your Greenfield Village visit, plan to enjoy luncheon cafeteria style in the historic Clinton Inn on the Village Green. We'll be looking forward to serving you. So it was a cafeteria. The lunchroom was nice, but you did wait in a cafeteria line. Also, when I started at the museum, the so-called colonial kitchen was used for fireplace cooking classes as part of the museum's adult education program. Most of you may not notice the big fireplace that's still there. The colonial kitchen is still there, but right now you're probably familiar with it because this is the place where the restrooms are. So next time you go to the restroom there, turn around and you'll see the big kitchen where these classes once were held. I took several of these classes back in the late 1970s. I was enamored about this idea of fireplace cooking. I wanted to learn what it was all about. I don't see myself in this photo. I think some of those people look a little familiar, and I may have known some of them. The teacher was Margaret Chalmers. She had a Scottish background. And so when she published this book, Colonial Fireplace Cooking and Early American Recipes, which we have in our library and might still be available on eBay, many of them have a Scottish root, which I didn't realize at the time, but there's some very interesting and wonderful recipes in there. So why did we choose Eagle Tavern and that era to interpret? To establish a date for the historic dining experience, we looked to primary sources. Primary sources. These are the kind of things that we do when we research all our historic structures. And these help us uncover the esoteric details of the past. These sources include probate records, property deeds, tax and census records, local newspapers, and old photographs. Through this research, we found that a man, I mentioned his name already, he was a farmer named Calvin Wood, ran this inn from 1849 to 54, along with his wife Harriet, their daughter Irene, and additional hired help or people that lived in the neighboring countryside. And he named the place Eagle Tavern. One of the clues to this was in this newspaper listing from the Tecumseh Herald. Tecumseh was a town down the road from Clinton that actually had a newspaper. Clinton didn't, but this is where we got a lot of our information. And in 1850, it listed this ad for the old Clinton Eagle. And what's interesting is right above that is a place called the Eagle Hotel. This was the competitor down the street, and interesting that they're both named Eagle. Eagle was an incredibly popular name given to taverns and hotels at this time. But we know that this was our building because of the name of the person. But interestingly, as always, primary sources can raise more questions than answers. And a lot of times they disagree with each other. So you have to figure out which one seems the most accurate. So here we have the old Clinton Eagle. We're not sure why it was old. Opposite the burnt district, we're not sure what the burnt district was, is again revived. Maybe there was a fire and it was closed down for a while. By the old original Caterer. In those days, caterer meant something a little different than it does now. It meant the proprietor of a dining establishment. And then C. Woods, well, they spelled his name wrong. So full of errors, full of questions. This is how all the wonderful things we get to look at as curators and try to figure out. But we did decide to put, when we put the sign out in front of the building, to use the word caterer. We kind of like that. So the sign that says Eagle Tavern, C. Wood, Caterer, is using the language of the era. And we think that doing things like that helps kind of add to the atmosphere of transporting people to the past, which is what we try to do with these kind of experiences. We decided that we did like that early 1850s date. Not only did we have decent documentation on Calvin Wood, but it was also a very interesting era for food and cooking and cookbooks. There were more ingredients available. There were more cookbooks becoming printed. Public dining practices were changing. Things like more choices for diners, better table etiquette, I'll get to that in a minute, more formalized meals and menus, and more specialized table settings. And as you can see in some of these pictures, the 1850s date nicely dovetailed with our new mission statement about change over time. This era was a time in which larger changes were beginning to transform people's lives. Social movements like the temperance movement, abolition, religious revivals, women's rights movement was just getting started. Changes in transportation from unpredictable stagecoaches to more predictable, certainly faster railroads. Improvements in communication networks like the telegraph, bringing news to the public much faster than before. And hugely important national occurrences, many going on during this time that were changing people's lives, among them the California Gold Rush, the Mexican War, all kinds of things were going on at this time that were impacting people's lives and how they thought about things. Taverns were very popular during this time. They just dotted the countryside everywhere along many, many, many roads. Why was this? The reason for this is because this was a period of massive migration. People were on the move everywhere. A lot of new settlement, people just traveling around, able to travel around, see the country. And there were many of these establishments were called stage taverns because they were routes along where stagecoaches went from place to place. And the stagecoaches and the drivers would have to stop to change horses and give people a chance to eat and rest. Once you had railroads, you didn't have as much reason to stop. People could just eat on the railroad, just keep going, and the whole nature of travel changed. And this is exactly what happened at Eagle Tavern. Started as a stagecoach tavern along the road, the Chicago Road, and would have had this kind of atmosphere as shown in these pictures. And then in the 1850s, a couple of railroads came through Michigan and bypassed Clinton, which kind of left places like this Eagle Tavern along a little less crowded, a little less busy, less on the main road. And so there were still roads that people took and went through to get to the railroads, as well as a lot of local people, as well as people kind of settling and moving around the area. So that's how Eagle Tavern and the names of the place after that name continued to operate, at least for a while. People of all types and classes mixed together in taverns. This is very important, and what brings us to the idea of the common table that we talk about in the dining room. Tavern patrons ate at the same tables, they slept in the same bedrooms, they socialized in the same public spaces. Privacy was virtually impossible and not even an expectation. Travelers of all types stopped at taverns for the night, including settlers moving west, farmers taking their produce to market, cattle drovers, land speculators, just all kinds of people, itinerant doctors, traveling entertainers, and even foreign tourists, a few of whom I'll be mentioning, out to observe America and Americans. And they wrote books on this. Charles Dickens was one of those people. Local patrons, as I mentioned, were also important to tavern business, using taverns for relaxing, socializing, gossiping, trading news, and attending community events like this, the county election, also political rallies, Independence Day celebrations, things like that. Now to take you inside the tavern, let's talk about this a little bit, what people did there. And again, it's all related to kind of a holistic idea of what went on in taverns. So when you go there to dine, and when people went there to dine, it wasn't just a restaurant. It was really a place for people to gather in all different kinds of ways. We'll start in the bar room. Now, some of these photos, including this one, were some photos that we actually staged and put together in 1982 using some of our new period clothing that we had just researched, and we were very proud to show that off, and just showing, give you an idea. It wasn't easy to find historic photos of bar rooms from this era, but giving you an idea of the kind of activities that might have taken place in our bar room at the time. So the bar room was often the first place for travelers to stop. Here, guests registered, paid their bills, arranged to board their horse, or might book passage on a public vehicle, a stagecoach. Barroom was primarily a place for men to socialize. All levels of society mixed and conversed. It was not unusual to find a lot of drinking, disorder, fighting, wagering, and heavy smoking. Many men smoked what was called, they were cigars, but in those days spelled S-E-G-A-R and pronounced cigars. So they smoked cigars, or they chewed tobacco. A lot of tobacco chewing. So intervals of drinking and chewing were often part of the daily ritual for countless men. And barroom floors, to the horror of the proprietors, were literally stained with tobacco juice because of all the copious spitting. And they tried to put spittoons, as you can see at the bottom of this photo, to provide them for the men, but the men often ignored them or missed them. So this is a sort of a classic image of men drinking, reading, talking, and playing cards. Some taverns, like Eagle Tavern, had a sitting room set off, and that's our room in the center, which we today use as a place for greeting diners and getting names and seating them. But in those days, it was called the sitting room, and it was a place where, again, men would often, very informal, tilt their chairs back, prop their feet up, and read newspapers. They, again, smoked cigars, as you can see the man on the right, or they might spit at random, and there's a spittoon again, interestingly, in this picture, and talk in pretty earthy terms. This was not a place for ladies. For the ladies, there was the ladies' parlor. And again, I show you on the left a wonderful historic photo. The date is probably about in the 1850s. And on the right is another photo that we staged with our interpreters and the great historic clothing that we started to have during that era in the early 80s. So men might be allowed in this space, but they had to observe proper conduct. They would have been closely watched and chaperoned. And this was just a more refined space, which we have also recreated in Eagle Tavern. The tavern keeper's wife, children, and other assistants would have spent most of their day in the kitchen. Cooking was done on an open fire with pots, kettles, and tea kettles. Baking would have been done in a built-in bake oven or a cast iron bake kettle with coals shoveled underneath or on top. And perhaps a tin reflecting roaster might have been placed in front of the fire, as shown here in this picture, with a spit for turning and roasting meat. As you can see here, sometimes the dining room was an open space connected with the bar room. But in our case, actually we learned from our research that the common table originally in what was Eagle Tavern would have been in what was also the kitchen. So the kitchen and dining room were one room. But then when Henry Ford added the big addition in the back, we're able to make a completely separate dining room of that space, which is really great. As far as dining went, 3 daily meals were served in a tavern of this era: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The midday dinner was the major meal of the day, while supper would have been a lighter meal consisting of cold meats. Tavern patrons were usually charged on what was called the American plan. This was a one price for lodging, meals, and other tavern services. And this might have ranged from about 50 cents to about $1.50 in a Michigan tavern at this time. As dining customs changed because of railroads, because of more population, because of social stratification, meals became available at all hours. Foods were served a la carte. Everything was charged separately, which came to be called the European plan. Menus might change daily, and charges were all separate. So my major task in developing the Eagle Tavern dining experience was to find out what and how people ate at the time. So I scoured, again, all kinds of primary sources: traveler's account of different sort, traveler's accounts, etiquette books, merchant's account books, newspaper ads, and historical reminiscences, looking for references to these. And if you can imagine, there was no internet. And so I searched mostly books and articles. A lot of my best books came from the University of Michigan Graduate Library that had an entire row of travel narratives, shelves and shelves and shelves of travel narratives. And I looked through pretty much every one, looking for references to travelers through Southern Michigan or the area, and looking for references to what people ate and how they ate. And you can see here, my very early, on a typewriter, typed lists, the first 2 pages of several pages of what I finally put together from all the accounts that I read, all the foods that I found, the ingredients I found, and specific accounts, quoted accounts from what they were saying about this kind of food. Some of what I found was pretty wild. In fact, most of it was pretty wild. And I copied a lot of the references. This is just one example to give you an idea. A woman, she was a British traveler and was pretty straightforward about everything. Her name was Isabella Bird, and she was traveling in Chicago in 1856 and described a meal that was set in front of the diners in this way: 8 boiled legs of mutton, nearly raw, 6 antiquated fowls whose legs were of the consistency of guitar strings, baked pork with onion fixings, the meat swimming in grease, and for vegetables, yams, corn cobs, and squash. A cup of stewed tea, sweetened by molasses, was at each plate. The second course consisted exclusively of pumpkin pies. So it's probably good that we didn't take these accounts completely literally when we developed the Eagle Tavern dining experience. But from these sources, we were able to get a ton of ideas. And I put together a list, like I said, of food and ingredients that became basically our go-to reference for everything that we did from that point. So now I'll go through a little bit of each kind of food and what I found, so some of the specifics of that came from travel accounts and narratives from the time. I did learn in general that tavern fare would have come from a combination of local farms, in this case, probably Calvin Wood's farm, would have grown wild in the local area or been purchased from local merchants. They were, there were stores around, there were grocery lists around, and things were available. Meat, so meat was the predominant component of the tavern meal. Everywhere I looked, meat, 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 lots and lots of it. Served in much greater quantity than today. Often 2 or more meats were served at one time. Pork was the staple food of many Midwestern settlers and travelers, and it was the meat that showed up the most in a variety of forms, including bacon, roast, salt, baked, smoked ham, sausage, and spare ribs. Chickens were also easy to raise on farms and lent themselves to a lot of different kind of dishes, and they could also supply eggs. In fact, a man named Lansing Swan, traveling through Sturgis, Michigan in 1841, wrote, "We had an excellent dinner, warm cakes, tea, etc., bacon and eggs. I have eaten them until I'm ashamed to see a hen and can hardly look a respectable porker in the face." Beef contributed a portion of the meals, as did wild game and fish from local lakes and rivers. Oysters were very popular at the time, packed on ice and transported by barrel from the East Coast. As far as vegetables, root crops lasted through the year, stored easily, and were very popular, particularly, it seems, potatoes, again, lending themselves to all kinds of dishes or just served plain. A man named Charles Hoffman, traveling through southern Michigan in 1833, wrote that he ate hot rolls, tea, large pieces of pork, there we go, pork again, swimming in its gravy, and a plate of potatoes that pulverized when you touched them. Less hardy vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, would have been served fresh in season or preserved for later use as ketchups, sauces, or pickles. Ketchups, there were all kinds of ketchups, way more than tomato ketchup back in those days, pages and pages of recipes. And in season, pumpkins, squash, and corn would have also been popular. Fruits were also available during their season, or they might be dried or made into preserves, sauces, and pickles. Of the fruits, apples were the most popular and found the most frequently. They were very versatile. Again, they could be stored, cooked, baked into numerous dishes. Other fruits I found included peaches, pears, apricots, grapes, berries of all sorts. Wild strawberries were referenced by Lansing Swan again a number of times in his account. He said that in Ypsilanti, he got an excellent supper for 25 cents and many large, delicious strawberries with rich cream. In Jackson, just in time for tea with strawberries and cream. In Niles, he and his companion came in time for another strawberry repast, and a rich one it was. We had a new dish, strawberry shortcake. Very fine indeed. This is why we serve strawberry shortcake at Eagle Tavern. And before leaving Niles the next morning, he partook of one last strawberry breakfast. One thing that this shows, in addition to what the specific foods are, that when foods were in season, they were served over and over and over again. It's kind of what we do. We've kind of gone back to that today in terms of really enjoying fresh fruits and vegetables of the season. Breadstuffs contributed substantially to tavern meals, and they were mentioned often in travel accounts as meal accompaniments, but not always with approval. For example, Cyrus Bradley, stopping at a tavern between Detroit and Pontiac in 1835, wrote, "The milk was sweet, but the bread was dry and stale, and as it began to saturate, the little red bugs rose, kicking most lustily to the surface, where they were immediately skimmed off and most barbarously committed to the flames." Wheat flour and cornmeal were most common. They could be obtained at local mills and used for baking breads, rolls, and biscuits. Charles Hoffman, again in 1833, remarked that Michigan had the best wheat bread in the world. Desserts, often referred to as pastries at the time, consisted primarily of fruit pies and boiled puddings like plum pudding with various sauces, sometimes cakes on fancier occasions. Those were the main kinds of desserts and pastries that were made. Dairy products like eggs, milk, and butter could be available from local farms. Cheese, there were a couple of cheese manufacturing centers nearby where cheese mostly came from, upstate New York and Ohio. And popular sweetenings included honey and maple syrup that would have been homemade or available locally, while molasses and sugar were available in various grades of refinement and would have been purchased. After putting together my food and ingredient list, I perused every historic cookbook I could get my hands on. Fortunately, there was an increasing number of cookbooks at this time rather than just the idea more in the 18th century where recipes were just handed down from generation to generation and they would have been handwritten. It was nice that we had an increasing number of cookbooks. Unfortunately, measurements were not precise. That didn't really happen until the 20th century, nor were cooking times and temperatures, and that is why we had to do a lot of recipe testing. So again, if you can imagine, there was no internet, we had no Amazon, we had no eBay. How did I look at cookbooks? My best source was the extensive cookbook collection of a food historian in Ann Arbor named Jan Langoni. I was so happy that she always gave me access to her food and cookbook library in her basement, and I ended up always buying a lot of cookbooks from her. Our library had cookbooks like this one, The Good Housekeeper. We acquired other historic ones. And then reprinted cookbooks were starting to come out around this time, and I would, every time I'd see one in a bookstore or sometimes kitchen stores would have them, and I would just started making my own collection, and this is where these books come from. Also, I found that the Michigan State University Library has an extensive collection of historic cookbooks, and I was able to go over there a couple of times and look at their amazing collection, and it was wonderful to peruse. Some of it is online now. Within the pages of these cookbooks, I searched for recipes that were both referenced in the historic accounts and recipes that seemed regional and fit my researched ingredient list. These are a couple of classics. This is from the Eagle Tavern cookbook that we published in 1988. Pork apple pie, it was a perfect recipe when I found it. And we served it in, we serve it on and off. We served it in our very first menu. It's basically a meat pie, like a British meat pie with apples in it, including some of our classic ingredients for that time and place. And in the cookbook, we included both the historic recipes and modern equivalents. So on the right, a historic recipe for mashed parsnips. Parsnips are one of those vegetables that show up in the ingredient lists, and I've never eaten a parsnip, but I did when we worked on this menu, and they're very delicious. They're kind of like potatoes, only they have more flavor, I'd say, for mashed vegetable. So here we include the historic recipe and its modern equivalent. I organized all my collected recipes by type of food, like entrees, pastries, soups, and vegetables, and then spent innumerable hours working with the food service managers at Eagle Tavern, perusing and selecting possible recipes. And they brought up all kinds of things I would have never considered as a curator, things like how much ingredients cost, how available they were, what kind of form they were available, like some things were available frozen, some were fresh, and basically all the things that food service staff have to think about. They also had to think about the durability of these dishes on the steam table of what was the old cafeteria line. Now, fortunately, we don't have to think about that anymore because we have a modern kitchen, but this was a big deal back in 1982. And then probably the topic that raised the most conversation between us, and that was how adventurous we thought modern audiences would be in trying things that were different and unusual. One of these, mock turtle soup, who even hears of that today, but it was all over the cookbooks during that time. And it's a very interesting recipe. It was delicious. It turns out that mock turtle soup was a cheaper imitation of green turtle soup that used real turtle, which had become very popular in Great Britain by sailors who brought it back from travels to the West Indies. And actually they had captured and cooked turtle and ate it on deck on their ships. And then they brought the idea back and said, turtle soup, it's wonderful. And so if you had the money and could be extravagant, you could have real turtle soup, but became much more popular in these cookbooks was something called mock turtle soup. The finding that there were other kinds of meat that could kind of simulate the taste and texture of turtle soup. And it turned out that in those days it was calf's head. Sometimes you would use calf's feet or calf's organs or all of these things. Now, today, we probably wouldn't use that, but in our modern recipe, you can see that we call for cooked beef, pork, or veal diced, and the way that they cooked it at Eagle Tavern was very delicious. So I don't remember us having a lot of contested conversation about this one. I think because we weren't talking about whether visitors would be interested in eating turtle soup. It was already the imitation of it, which was a beef soup. So that was not one of the things that we had a lot of conversation about. But again, I showed this from the Eagle Tavern cookbook, which shows the amazing historic recipe and then our modern equivalent. To balance out some of the more primitive meal descriptions that I read from the travel accounts, I also looked for menus of the era. What did people eat as a meal progressed? What were the courses like? What were they called? What were some of the foods that were served during this time? Now, there weren't a lot of menus during that era. I think that most places didn't have menus. But when they did, when I did find menus, they tended to be from larger hotels like Adams House that was in Boston, larger cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and also for special days or special holidays. So as you can see, this one was produced for Thanksgiving in 1847. So to walk you through this a little bit, it's a little bit small. I did find, even though this is a very elaborate menu, it's a very consistent format of every menu that I found. They tended to start with soup. They would move through a fish course, various meat courses. A lot of times the entree course would be more fancy, elegant, prepared dishes. Then a list of vegetables, either a few or the many listed here. A roast course, a game course. It's amazing how many courses there are. Then something called pastry and confectionery, and you can see desserts are called pastries, and they tend to be puddings and pies. Something called ornaments, which is very interesting, probably on a big table. Something called Gothic pyramids, which were mountainous shapes with pastries attached to a pyramid-looking shape. It had baskets of fruit. It had something called candy temples. I'm not sure what that was. And then at the end, something called dessert, which in those days, dessert was referred to as that kind of after dinner, almost snack that you would then maybe drink your sherry, your port, your coffee, your tea. And it tended to consist of maybe some fruit, but a lot of times dried fruit and different kinds of nuts. So I look at this and I think the phrase from soup to nuts fits nicely here. And maybe even this is where the phrase came from. So this was our very first Eagle Tavern Bill of Fare, spring of 1982, and we changed with the seasons because we felt strongly that Eagle Tavern needed to have a seasonal menu. I think we even do more than 3 now. We even do kind of groups within sub-seasons within seasons sometimes. So to walk you through this a little bit, our soups were pea soup, pretty straightforward. Family soup, which was a vegetable soup and is in the Eagle Tavern cookbook of 1988. Now, we had a lot of conversation about sandwiches because sandwiches were not a big thing in 1850, especially at dinner, at supper maybe, but the midday dinner did not have cold foods very frequently. We did find a couple of recipes for sandwiches served on, we had a really nice slices of wheat bread. We found the acceptable cold meats that we found in recipes, which were ham and turkey, mostly. The entrees, we chose a range of seafood and meat that were kind of classic. The baked pickerel would have been locally obtained. There were many, many, many recipes for sauces. And so a lot of our foods had sauces on them. that great pork apple pie, then a classic roast beef with 2 choices of sauce, wine sauce and horseradish sauce. I'm sure the vegetables of the season had mashed parsnips. I don't remember what else. Pastry included something called Eve's pudding, which was a boiled pudding. I know it had raisins in it, the classic apple pie. And then we had something called New York cupcake. I don't remember exactly what that was, but I think that it was like a cake recipe and probably a muffin pan, or what would have been called a gem pan at the time, with a really nice cream sauce. And then we did have, in the beginning, the peanuts and raisins, which we served as dessert. We ended up removing those from the menu because they'd get stuck on the floor a lot, they get stuck on the table a lot, and it was a lot of extra work. The dining experience took the same amount of research and involved the same amount of conversation as the food. We took the table setting from a book, this picture in a book from the 1850 book, Miss Beecher's Domestic Receipt Book. And as you can see, it had, if you follow along the bottom and the top, it has plate, it has a fork on the left, it has the napkin and the coffee cup on the right, and then it has the knife across the top. That was kind of different. And then as far as the dining, and I include another one of those staged photos that we took in 1982 to show people what the dining experience would be like. And these beautiful color photos come from our Eagle Tavern cookbook again. Really give you an idea of what some of the food would look like served family style. So according to travel narratives of the era, tavern dining was fast and furious. For example, one traveler in Chicago in 1836 wrote, "Every man for himself and none for his neighbor, hurrying, snatching, gulping like famished wildcats, victuals disappearing as if by magic." Partly, this was because there were often more patrons than there was room at the table. This one common table was sometimes not big enough for everybody. So to resolve this, sometimes diners took turns eating, as James Logan describes at a hotel in Detroit in 1838. And he wrote, "Very little conversation took place. Each individual seemed to hurry on as fast as possible. And the moment one finished, he rose and went away. There was no change of plates, knives, or forks, everything being eaten off the same plate, excepting pudding, which was taken in saucers." So for the Eagle Tavern dining experience, we knew we didn't want to replicate that, but we did want to recreate the idea of the common table. And there was a lot of conversation about what to do for that, because we today are much more interested in privacy. And fortunately, because of the spacious cafeteria space, we're able to have several tables, kind of treat them as if they're common tables, and let people sit at their own tables if they desire privacy. And what I hear is that during for COVID safety protocols, that's the sort of thing we're going to be doing for a while, yet is not seat anybody who isn't in a group together at the same table. They'll always be at different tables. So a little bit about the drinks. At the same time I was researching the drinks, another curator, the curator of agriculture named Peter Cousins, was researching the beverages and drinking habits of the era. And he found that there was a lot of drinking going on. In fact, more then than there ever had been before and ever has been since. And that is why the temperance movement got really big at that time, started and led by women, and eventually they did have some success, and it led to some changes and reduced amount of drinking. And that is why we offer temperance drinks. That's a kind of a nod to the temperance movement with our effervescing drinks, which you can see the recipe, one of the recipes here from our cookbook, which is made up of fruit syrup and soda water, really good. And also we have lemonade, tea and coffee, all temperance drinks. But here's a summary of some of the popular alcoholic beverages of the day. The most popular beverage of the period was whiskey, straight corn whiskey for the most part. Rum, which had been very popular in the 18th century, was declining a bit. Cider fresh cider, of course, in season, but fermented or hard cider throughout the year, very popular in this area where a lot of apples are grown. Beer tended to be British style ale at the time. Lager beer was just starting to come in some of the cities that had German immigrants, and it wasn't really spread to Eagle Tavern yet. Wine was also not that popular at the time, except for expensive sweet clarets and heavy sherry and port, taken usually drunk at the end of the meal. I will mention on the hard cider and ale that those were both very hard to come by in 1982. We almost couldn't find them, but they are so much more around since then because of all the artisanal breweries. So that's been a really good thing that's happened. And then there were all kinds of mixed drinks like cocktails, as shown here with the recipe, juleps, punches, a stone wall, shown here again, which was a mixture of rum and hard cider. These were considered more refined and considered more proper for gentlemen and even sometimes for ladies. As you can see, after a while, we took our bill of fare, like the Adams House, and put our drink list around the edges so we could have the menu, the food menu and the drink list all in one. And then we talk about, and hopefully you've tried this, drink with a macaroni straw. This was actually something that came out of the historic research. We found that some drinks had recipes that called for something called a sucker. And so we looked that up and found that a sucker was a hollow tube used for mixed drinks that might be made out of straw, which is where that word comes from today, silver, glass, or macaroni. So we tried that and found that they worked really well. I did hear that we're not using those right now because of COVID restrictions, but hopefully they'll come back soon. I also notice on the right, it's funny how quickly our adult education classes went from colonial cooking to 10 Nights in a Bar Room, which was more historic. So 10 Nights in a Bar Room was actually a real book from the 1850s that was actually a temperance novel trying to discourage people from drinking. And I think it did have a lot of impact, but we used it as an opportunity to give people an idea of kind of teach them about what the different drinks were on the menu and also give them some tastes of them. And as I remember, I think you got 10 different drinks. So back to 1982, as I mentioned, that is when we opened. I love the clothing. This was really the first time we were, staff were wearing clothing that really was researched from the era. And that photo on the left always kind of fills me with pride when I see that. And on the right, digging in my files, I found a President's Society invitation to a dinner at Eagle Tavern. It was our first dinner and our first chance to show everyone what Eagle Tavern dining experience would be like. This was April 24th, 1982. And so I showed the cover of the invitation and the inside. It talks about what you can expect. You got to take a carriage from the village entrance, and it cost $15.50, which doesn't sound too bad now. And I would say Eagle Tavern today is pretty much like it was back when we opened. I'm happy to say, I would say I think the food may be more flavorful because I think we source food locally more than we did back then. I would say the hard cider and the ale are much more plentiful. I would say I believe that we are all more adventurous eaters than people were back in the 1980s. So these are all good things for Eagle Tavern. And to me, this has always been and still is one of the best historic dining experiences around. So I encourage you to go out there and enjoy or re-enjoy the Eagle Tavern dining experience. It's a very unique offering that we have in Greenfield Village. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, for this exceptional program. Eagle Tavern is so special and so full of memories, and I know lots of us can't wait for that first meal back. So I hope to see lots of folks, lots of our members in the village this weekend for Member Appreciation Days and for the Tavern's exclusive reopening for members. Now we have time for a couple of questions. A couple have come in, but please do keep submitting those. We'll start with a few that have come in so far, starting with something, Donna, you just mentioned about the adventurous eating. What's an example of how you think we are more adventurous eaters today than Americans might have been back when Eagle Tavern first opened?
Well, I think the whole idea of foodies was just emerging. And I think that we consider that part of what's kind of food has become more fun, and going out to eat has become more fun. I think that foods that were kind of alternative in the 1970s and early 80s have become mainstream, and people are just used to, my phone, used to trying things. I think of a couple of things that we had so much conversation about and might not be such a big issue now. I mentioned the mock turtle soup, but also I remember, along with the other cold meats, the ham and turkey, one of them that raised a ton of discussion and never got accepted was the idea of serving cold tongue, beef tongue. Now I grew up in a Jewish family, so I remember seeing the tongues lined up in a row in the cases of the delicatessen, and we had tongue, cold and warm, and it was pretty good, but it grossed out everyone in food service at the time. They're like, there's no way we're ever serving tongue. Are you kidding? But, these days, who knows? It's like charcuterie plates and, trying foods from different cultural groups, and we might try something like that. So I feel that the way that foods that used to be so exotic are now at Kroger's, I think we could, it's all about, kind of us trying to encourage people to try things that they might not have tried. And I think back in those days, there was definitely a rule of like, if people don't eat it, we're not serving it. So I'm hoping that that's changing.
It's so interesting to think of people in the 19th century having all of this exotic food.
Right.
I think we have all of these kind of food resources now. So lots more questions, and we'll try to squeeze a few more in. Next one is about kind of the era, and this is really interesting. How did the Civil War affect taverns in the North and the South?
Well, I don't know if the question is about people that stayed there or about food. I'm sure it was dependent on who left the area to be in the war, who might have been in the area because of the war. I know there are things that there's, sort of food processes that the war encouraged, like canned and processed foods for soldiers. So after the war, like preserves became a lot more popular. And there were also crossovers of cultural things that happened by people, soldiers going to areas they hadn't been. And so, baseball became like more of a national sport because of that. So there might have been different kind of news and different kind of practices that might have been spread to different areas because of that. It's a big question.
It is a big question.
And, I studied the 1850s, not so much the 1860s. So that's, I'm sure you would have had a different kind of traveling going on during that time, less by some people, more by others. So that definitely would have affected taverns at the time.
Thank you. This one's a little bit more straightforward. Would local people have visited Eagle Tavern just to dine in the 19th century, or would the diners always have been just the hotel guests?
Yeah, I definitely believe that local people would have hung out at the tavern. In fact, I'm sure that they hung out at the tavern. Now, whether they hung out just to drink and socialize or for a special occasion, or whether they came to dine, that's a good question. There were during those times I think there were places where people could lodge, but didn't particularly offer dining. And so this would have been a good place for like single people to dine, or yeah, I'm sure it was different between like farm families and like people in town. And also just remember the idea that there wasn't really the idea of a restaurant yet, but that it was kind of a full service. You went there to socialize, to hang out, to eat. And that's kind of a lot of what was going on there.
Excellent. And that might be a good segue into our next question, actually, especially where you mentioned the drinking part. Do you know about any significant barroom brawls at Eagle Tavern that you could tell us about?
We unfortunately I don't think we found any specific references to life inside Eagle Tavern at the time. We found mostly information about the background of Calvin Wood and his family, and who else lived in town, and might have gone to the tavern. But that's a little different than what I found about the Waterford and the general store, where there really was kind of a brawl in the hotel across the street from the general store by the baseball team. So, that I definitely found a reference to, but I did not find a reference here. Just many, 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 many references to the amount of drinking and always the potential of rowdiness that might happen because of that.
Oh gosh, a baseball brawl does sound like a major event.
And in fact, the La-Di-Da's name that we have in the village is named after the Waterford La-Di-Da's that came from that town. So it's all interconnected. We're not sure whether that means our La-Di-Da's should behave in a certain way, but that we did get that name from there.
Oh gosh, yeah. Our La-Di-Da's are the brawlers. That's wild. Well, we're just about at our hour, so we'll do one more question, I think. And this one, particularly is for you, Donna, of course. What is your favorite part, or what was your favorite part of developing the Eagle Tavern dining, the whole experience, the menu, everything?
Yeah, everything. I love research. I love delving into the past, and every time I found a passage in one of those travel accounts would be like a treasure to me. And then putting it all together and then taking that and going to the recipes became kind of a pathway through all these cookbooks. And that was really enjoyable. And then another wonderful thing that all of us curators love, I think, is when we plan something like that, we can only imagine it in our minds. And then when the time comes to actually have it happen, furnishing the spaces, doing the table settings, watching the recipes turn into real food, watching visitors come in and use it, seeing presenters in the clothing that we only imagined. That is so satisfying to see it all come together into a real thing. And then you realize that through your efforts and through your research, you have helped create something that hopefully existed in the past, and you're trying to kind of bring it back and welcome people from the present into it, the way that you've enjoyed it for all the months you've been working on it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And I think that's the last question we'll have time for today. So of course, thank you again to Donna and to everyone joining today for today's member program. We love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members. And we're so grateful that you continue to connect with us here in our virtual programs. If you enjoyed today's virtual program, I hope you'll join us again for our next THF conversation for members. You can always find the schedule with the upcoming topics at thf.org, or again, always, of course, when you subscribe to our emails. So as we wrap up today, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford, and we'll see you next time.